Nobody moved to stop it. That was the part Phoebe Aldred would remember long after everything else faded. Not the sharpness of the slap, not the gasp that rippled through the hotel lobby, not even the way her cheek went numb before the sting arrived. What she would remember was the stillness of 30 people who watched an old woman being dragged by the arm and chose, collectively, to do absolutely nothing. It had started quietly, the way most cruelties do. Ruth. That was what the elderly woman had given as her name when she'd checked into the restaurant reservation system 40 minutes earlier, had finished her lunch alone at a corner table near the window. Phoebe had watched her throughout the afternoon shift, not out of suspicion, out of recognition. Ruth had the particular stillness of someone accustomed to eating alone, someone who had long since made peace with her own company. She'd ordered the salmon, taken her time over a cup of chamomile tea, and left a tip that was arguably more generous than the meal itself warranted. When Ruth approached the hostess stand to retrieve her coat from the check, Ingrid Parrish appeared. Ingrid was the hotel's food and beverage director, a woman in her mid-40s who wore authority the way other people wore perfume, constantly and in quantities that made everyone nearby uncomfortable. She had a specific look she reserved for guests she'd already decided were beneath the establishment. She was wearing it now. "Excuse me." Ingrid placed herself directly between Ruth and the coatroom door. "Before you leave, I need to ask you something." Ruth looked up with mild confusion. "Of course." "The loyalty card you used when you booked your reservation." Ingrid's voice carried just enough volume to reach the surrounding tables. "We've had reports of fraudulent accounts being used in this hotel. I'm going to need you to wait while we verify your identity. I have my ID right here." "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult." Ingrid nodded once toward the lobby. Two security guards materialized with the practiced speed of people who had been briefed in advance. One took Ruth's elbow, not roughly, but firmly enough that Ruth's small frame went rigid with surprise. "I paid for my meal," Ruth said. Her voice was steady, but her free hand had begun to tremble. "I've been a member of this hotel's dining program for 11 years. 11. You can check." "We are checking," Ingrid said, as though that were an explanation rather than a dismissal. The guests nearest to them had shifted in their chairs. A few reached for their phones. Nobody intervened. Phoebe had been pretending to organize the reservation tablet at the hostess stand for the past 40 seconds, running through every logical reason this wasn't her business. She was a hostess, a part-time one, filling in through a staffing agency. She had no authority here. Ingrid could have her contract terminated with a single phone call. She was 2 weeks behind on her car payment. This was not the hill. Then one of the security guards tightened his grip on Ruth's arm, and Ruth made a small, involuntary sound. Not a cry, just a breath that got squeezed out, and Phoebe stopped pretending. She crossed the lobby in 8 steps. "I processed Mrs. Ruth's reservation myself this morning," Phoebe said, inserting herself between Ruth and Ingrid, with the calm of someone who had already committed and wasn't going to waste energy on second thoughts. The loyalty account cleared on the first attempt. No flags. Ingrid turned to face her with an expression of theatrical patience. "And you are?" "Phoebe Aldred, Hostess Station, afternoon shift." She kept her voice even. "I can pull the transaction ID from the system if that's helpful." "That won't be necessary." Ingrid took a small step forward, a territorial gesture, subtle enough that only Phoebe recognized it for what it was. "This is a management matter. Please return to your station." "I'll return to my station once the guards release this guest." Silence. Several seconds of it, the kind that had texture. Ingrid's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, the recalibration of someone who had expected a different reaction. She lifted her hand. It was meant for Ruth, a dismissive gesture, a pointed finger, the visual signal that she was done with the conversation and someone else should remove the obstacle. But she was close enough that it read as a strike. Phoebe didn't think about it. She stepped into the motion. The back of Ingrid's hand caught Phoebe across the cheek with a crack that silenced the restaurant entirely. Phoebe didn't move, didn't stagger. She turned her face back slowly, feeling the heat bloom from her cheekbone down toward her jaw, and she looked at Ingrid with the kind of steadiness that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "You can hit me again," she said quietly, "but you are not touching her." The room had the quality of a photograph. Everything suspended, no one breathing. Then someone's phone chimed, and the spell broke, and 3 people started talking at once, and one of the security guards took his hand off Ruthen's arm like the elbow had gone hot. The general manager arrived 4 minutes later. The transaction records were pulled. Ruth's loyalty account, one of the hotel's oldest and most consistently active, as it turned out, showed 11 years of dining history, a clean verification, and a charge that had cleared without incident at 12:47 that afternoon. There was no fraud. There had never been fraud. Ingrid had acted on a suspicion that amounted to nothing more substantial than the way Ruth was dressed. Ingrid offered something that resembled an apology. It had the shape of one without any of the content. Ruth thanked the general manager, collected a coat, and said nothing further to Ingrid at all. In the lobby, while they waited for Ruth's car to be retrieved from valet, Phoebe sat beside her on one of the silk-upholstered benches and held a cold compress from the bar against her cheek. "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said. "I know. You could lose your position here. Also know that." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you?" Phoebe thought about it honestly. Because there were 30 people in that room who were going to let it happen. And I didn't want to be the 31st. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. The particular, unhurried attention of someone who was accustomed to reading people accurately and rarely needed to revise their first impressions. "What's your name, sweetheart? Your full name?" "Phoebe Aldred." Ruth nodded slowly. "I won't forget it." She said it like a promise. Phoebe had no reason yet to understand what that meant. 16 miles north, in a building whose address appeared in no public directory, and whose elevators required a specific key card that fewer than 40 people in the city possessed, Dante Mace was reviewing quarterly logistics reports when his phone rang. He let it ring twice before answering. He always did. "Sir." His head of security, a man named Garrett, spoke in the measured tone that indicated something had happened but no one was dead. "Your mother's detail lost her in the Gold Coast around noon. She was recovered at approximately 2:30. She's home and unharmed." Dante set down his pen. "Unharmed," he repeated. "Yes, sir, but there was an incident at the Langley Hotel. We've pulled footage." He watched the footage twice. The first time, he watched the entire room, the placement of the guards, the positioning of the guests, the specific moment 30 people decided to become spectators. The second time, he watched only one person, the hostess who had crossed the lobby without hesitating. She was a young woman, full-figured, in a plain black uniform that was slightly too formal for the warmth in her face. She had positioned herself in front of his mother, with the complete absence of strategy. No calculation about cost or consequence, just a body in motion towards something that needed to be stopped. When Ingrid's hand caught her across the face, she didn't flinch. She turned back and said something. The footage had no audio, but Dante was good at reading mouths. "You are not touching her." He watched the line of her jaw when she said it, steady as a wall. "What's her name?" he asked. "Phoebe Aldred, 28. Agency hostess. Occasional placement at the Langley. She has a business degree she's not using, a car that needs new brakes, and a studio apartment in Pilsen. No connection to anyone relevant." Keep watching her. Garrett waited. That particular silence meant there was more coming. Gently, Dante added. Nothing that would frighten her. If anything changes in her circumstances, job, safety, finances, I want to know immediately. Understood. He ended the call and returned to the logistics report. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained none of it. Eventually, he set it aside. Through the floor-to-ceiling window, Chicago spread out below him in the early evening. A city he controlled in ways that appeared in no newspaper and no court record. Entire distribution networks moved at his direction. Other organizations maintained their boundaries because his name alone served as sufficient warning. He had built this empire without a single unnecessary act of violence, which was considerably more difficult than it sounded and considerably more effective than anyone expected. None of that had prepared him for watching a woman in a plain black uniform stand in front of his mother and take a slap that wasn't meant for her. He stood at the window for a long time. Ruth visited the Langley 3 days later. She arrived at 11 before the lunch rush and sat at the corner table by the window that she apparently considered hers by some unspoken right of tenure. When Phoebe came to deliver the menu, Ruth closed it immediately. I'd like the chamomile tea and whatever you recommend. The Eggs Benedict are good on Tuesdays. Chef gets better produce. Eggs Benedict, then. Ruth folded her hands on the table. Sit with me for a moment. I'm working. I've already spoken with the front desk. They've kindly given me their best hostess for 20 minutes. Ruth smiled with the gentle implacability of someone who was used to being listened to. Please sit. Phoebe sat. They talked for 45 minutes. Ruth asked questions the way a person did, when they were genuinely curious rather than filling time. About Phoebe's degree, her work, the neighborhood she lived in, what she was reading, whether she liked the city or merely tolerated it. Phoebe, who had spent most of her adult life treating herself as someone not particularly worth asking about, found herself answering honestly before she'd thought to be careful. Ruth came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. By the 4th week, the chamomile tea arrived before she sat down, and Phoebe had started setting aside the table by the window as a standing reservation. The other staff had noticed. They had opinions. Phoebe ignored them. Ruth brought flowers once, white tulips from a market stall, and set them in the small vase near the hostess stand without explanation. She brought a paperback novel the week after, pressed into Phoebe's hands as she was leaving. You'll like the ending, she said. It's honest. What she didn't tell Phoebe was that she described every visit to her son in detail that evening over dinner. What she also didn't tell Phoebe was that her son had begun, occasionally, taking a different route to his morning meetings, one that happened to pass the Langley Hotel at approximately the time Phoebe's shift began. He had not gone inside, not yet. He was watching the way she moved through the lobby, the particular care she took with elderly guests, the slight adjustment in her posture when someone treated her like furniture, the way she smiled. Genuinely, not professionally, when a small child ran into the restaurant and she had to redirect them gently back toward their parents. He was cataloging these things with the same methodical attention he brought to intelligence reports, and arriving at conclusions he hadn't fully decided what to do with. He came in on a Wednesday morning in October, alone, and sat at the bar. Phoebe was at the hostess stand, reorganizing the reservation system, and she glanced up when the door opened out of professional habit. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, tall, dark-suited, carrying himself like someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room, and then looked back at her screen. "Bar's open," she said without looking up again. "Breakfast menu runs until 11. He sat. She brought him a menu. He studied it with the focused expression of someone who was used to being given information and assessing it without rushing. What's good here? Depends what you want. She leaned against the bar, arms folded. If you're trying to impress someone, order the smoked salmon plate. If you're actually hungry, get the short rib hash. He looked at her. Short rib hash. Good choice. She called the order back and returned to her station. He watched her work. The efficient precision of her movements, the way she greeted the next two guests with completely different energies based on what they seemed to need. The fact that she did all of it without appearing to think about it. When the food arrived, she brought it herself, rather than sending one of the servers. "You look like you've been up since 5, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Is that obvious? You ordered breakfast at 10:47 on a Wednesday and you're alone. Either you've been up since 5 or your morning meeting went badly. She tilted her head slightly. My guess is the 5 o'clock. Your guess is correct. Then eat while it's hot. She picked up the coffee pot. You'll make better decisions on a full stomach. She said it the way someone might say it to a friend. Not to a stranger, not to a man whose suit probably cost more than her monthly rent, and moved on without waiting for his response. He ate. It was genuinely the best breakfast he'd had in recent memory. He came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. He sat at the same spot at the bar and ordered the same thing, and Phoebe had it ready before he asked by the third visit. You're a creature of habit, she observed. I find it efficient. Most people use efficient to mean they're afraid of change. She refilled his coffee without being asked. Are you afraid of change, or are you actually just efficient? He thought about it longer than she expected. I haven't decided yet. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she covered it quickly with the professional composure that was her default armor. But for half a second it had been entirely genuine, and he found that half second unexpectedly significant. He didn't tell her his name. She didn't ask. It had become, without either of them acknowledging it, a comfortable arrangement. Ruth was the one who told her. Not directly. Ruth had a preference for arriving at things indirectly, letting understanding build in a person at its own pace. What she said, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in November while Phoebe was cutting the stems off the fresh flower delivery, was this. My son is going to be at the foundation dinner next month. I'd like you to come. Phoebe set down the scissors. Mrs. Ruth. I'm not asking you as a favor. I'm asking because I'd like you there. A pause. He'd like to meet you properly. Properly. Phoebe repeated the word carefully, meaning he already knows who I am. He knows you were kind to an old woman when a room full of people chose not to be. Ruth's eyes were steady and warm and entirely unashamed. He's known for some time. The pieces assembled themselves in a way Phoebe didn't particularly enjoy. The Wednesday morning visits. The man at the bar, who never gave his name and always paid in cash and watched her with the particular attention of someone who was used to seeing things clearly. His name is Dante Mace, Ruth said. Phoebe's hands went still. She knew that name. Anyone who had lived in Chicago for more than 2 years and paid even marginal attention to the undercurrent of the city knew that name. Not from newspapers, because Dante Mace didn't appear in newspapers, but from the way certain conversations stopped. When certain subjects came up, the careful geography of which neighborhoods were genuinely safe, and which ones were safe because of an agreement nobody discussed publicly. Oh, she said. You're not frightened, Ruth observed. I'm processing. Take your time. Ruth accepted the small bundle of white tulips Phoebe had been about to throw away. He asked me to tell you that he understands if you don't come, and that if you do come, he won't make you regret it. The foundation dinner was held at a restored theater in the West Loop. 300 people in formal dress, a live string quartet, and an open bar that had been stocked with the specific preferences of every major donor on the guest list. Phoebe stood inside the entrance in a dark green dress she'd bought on sale and spent 3 days convincing herself not to return, and felt every inch of the distance between herself and the rest of the room. She was too much in every direction, too big, too plain, too outside. The familiar monologue started up in the back of her head. The one she'd been listening to since middle school, the one that narrated her own insufficiency in a voice that sounded reasonable precisely because it had so many years of practice. Then Ingrid Parrish walked through the opposite door. She was there as a +1 to a hospitality industry sponsor, wearing something expensive and holding a champagne flute like a shield. When she saw Phoebe, the recognition arrived first, followed almost immediately by contempt. She crossed the room with the confident stride of someone who had decided this was the version of events she was going to control. "I'll be honest," Ingrid said, her voice pitched for an audience. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was invited." Phoebe kept her voice neutral. "I'm sure you were." Ingrid's gaze made a slow circuit of her. "Are you working the coat check?" Several people nearby went quiet. "No," Phoebe said. "I'm a guest." Ingrid smiled with her teeth. "Of course you are." She leaned in slightly. "Do yourself a favor, sweetheart. Events like this aren't for people like us. Go home before you embarrass yourself." She reached out and took hold of Phoebe's wrist. Not hard, but like something that belonged to her. "Come on, I'll show you where." Let go of her. The voice came from behind Phoebe, low, completely calm, and carrying across the suddenly silent room with an ease that suggested it was accustomed to being the last thing said on any given subject. Ingrid let go. Dante Mace moved to stand beside Phoebe. Not in front of her, which would have been its own kind of removal, but beside her. Level. He looked at Ingrid with an expression that contained no anger whatsoever. Anger would have been easier. What his face contained was the particular quality of someone who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "This woman," he said, and his eyes moved briefly to Phoebe before returning to Ingrid and to the room at large, walked into a lobby full of people who were watching my mother be humiliated. She was the only one who moved. She accepted a hit meant for someone else without hesitating, without calculation, without knowing who my mother was or what that choice might cost her. His voice remained level throughout. "Tonight you looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong. She's the reason my mother wasn't alone when she needed someone." A pause. "You are not welcome at any event I have any connection to. Not this one, not any future one. Do you understand?" Ingrid's glass of champagne had gone very still in her hand. She understood. The drive back was quiet in the way that felt like permission. No pressure to fill it, no performance required. Chicago moved past the windows in amber and white, and Phoebe watched it without seeing it. "You already knew," she finally said. "When you came to the bar, you already knew everything." "Yes. You could have just introduced yourself, instead of letting me tell you your eggs were getting cold." Something shifted in his expression. "I wanted you to know me before you knew what I was." She turned toward him. "And what are you?" He told her. Not with apology, and not with pride. With the same directness he'd used in the theater. The particular honesty of someone who had spent enough time in rooms where half the truth was the default to understand the specific value of the whole thing. He told her about the organization, what it controlled and what it didn't, the rules he'd constructed and why, what the Mace name meant to people who had reason to know it. When he finished, the car had stopped outside her building. "That's a lot," she said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother knew, didn't she? The whole time. She thought she was setting something up." She was absolutely setting something up. She's been doing it for 4 months, and she's very pleased with herself. Despite everything, Phoebe laughed. She looked down at her hands. I spent 6 weeks making sure I never stood too close to the bar, making sure I didn't take up too much space, making sure you didn't notice me noticing you. She shook her head. And meanwhile, you'd already. Yes, that's embarrassing. It's not. He said it with a certainty that wasn't soft and wasn't gentle. It was simply definite, the way facts were definite. From the first morning I came in, you were the most honest person in the room. That's not a small thing to me. He looked at her directly. I've sat across from people who spend their entire lives in the business of strategic impression. You told me my food was getting cold. She pressed her lips together to keep the smile from being too much. It was getting cold. You were right. A pause. He reached across and very carefully, without pressure, set his hand over hers. Not demanding anything, just placing it there, available. You don't have to give me an answer tonight about any of it. I'd rather you take the time you need than tell me what you think I want to hear. She looked at his hand. Large, steady, the kind of still that came from a person who had learned, through considerable difficulty she suspected, to wait. She turned her hand over and held it. 3 months later, Ruth Mace sat at the head of a Sunday dinner table surrounded by people she loved, which was the only version of Sunday dinner she had any patience for. She had told her son more than once that she would not waste perfectly good pot roast on company she didn't like, and she had meant it every time. Near the end of the meal, someone asked her, a cousin's wife who was attending for the first time, how she had known about Phoebe. Ruth set down her fork. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. She stood between me and a woman who was going to hurt me, she said. She didn't know my name. She didn't know this family. She didn't know what any of it might mean for her own safety. She paused. She only knew that someone frightened shouldn't have to stand alone. The table had gone quiet. Phoebe felt the words settle somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where she'd spent 30 years keeping a running inventory of her own inadequacies. Beneath the table, Dante found her hand without looking for it. She held on. She was done apologizing for how much space she took up. She was done waiting to be noticed by people who had already decided what they were going to see. The woman who had crossed a hotel lobby, with her heart hammering and her jaw set and her entire body a deliberate barrier between cruelty and someone who couldn't fight it alone. That woman had been there all along, in every quiet, careful act of her ordinary life. She didn't need to become someone else. She had just needed someone to finally look.